like some of the SOCs, actually undertake in the billions of rands. Similarly, that we will work with the Auditor General in order to actually do that. So as a department, in the last 50-odd working days since our appointment on, I think, the 28th of February, and the appointment of various boards, what has been our approach? Firstly, it is to recognize that we're dealing, in many cases in our department, with very powerful institutions that have budgets of tens of billions of rands, that have an asset base of hundreds of billions of rands, and have a huge impact on the lives of South Africans if they work well, or if, in fact, they don't work too well. The second point is that the potential that these institutions have to actually contribute positively to the economy in promoting inclusive growth, investment in the economy, which is a key focus of government at this point in time, job creation, promoting small and medium-sized businesses, and generally creating confidence in our economy and building the right partnerships between these institutions and the private sector was compromised in the last few years as a result of the state capture phenomena. And in fact, our department was pretty much at the center of the state capture phenomenon. So let's talk frankly about it. Now, our endeavor, in line with what the President said at the State of the Nation address, is to actually ensure that in the first instance, if you like, we want to recapture the institutions. And what does recapturing mean? It means getting the governance right in each of the 6 institutions that we are responsible for. And that means reviewing all the boards, the kind of record that they've had over a period of time, the kind of diligence with which they've applied themselves to tackling the misdemeanors and malfeasance that have happened in those entities, and whether they've been effective in stopping state capture or interrupting its flow. Similarly, once boards are in place, to look at the senior management, sometimes appointing acting people, and I'll come back to that in a moment, although we don't want to get to the Hollywood stage just yet, but the acting stage in this process is quite important. And in other instances, asking boards to actually look very carefully at the record of senior management and what have they been doing over the last 5 or 6 years. And in terms of all of the information available, either from forensic investigations or public reports and assertions that have been unchallenged, begin to ask some serious questions about whether these are the right people to take the institution forward at this point in time. The third area, which state capture also resulted in many institutions, not in the 6 only that we are talking about, is the technical capacity. Now, many of these institutions need high-level technical capability. And invariably, if you have technical people with integrity and the correct ethical way of approaching business, then, and you want to make wrong decisions in those institutions, the first instinct, as we've seen in many environments, including some of the SOCs that report to us, is remove those people, notwithstanding the consequences that has for the efficacy with which these institutions can actually work. The fourth, in relation to governance, is to get a culture of accountability. What does this mean? It means to understand that both at a board level and at a management level, we understand very clearly, including the tens of thousands of people that are employed in these institutions, that these are, in the first instance, at this point in time, public institutions. They're required to work in the public interest, and therefore they require an extraordinary level of accountability to the public, to institutions like Parliament, and a culture of accountability needs to be created. And I'm sure, as many people know, once that culture embeds itself, then you have a different kind of a way of doing business, as opposed to one which says, I'm only accountable to my golf course friends or my cocktail friends or whatever the case might be, and anything I do in this enterprise must actually ensure that they are appropriately rewarded in terms of the business that we actually do. And finally, one of the things that both boards and management need to look at carefully is, are there adequate controls? Are there adequate checks and balances to ensure that the right kind of decisions are actually made? And if they're not being made, that these checks and balances and controls either expose the wrong decisions that are being made or stop them in their tracks. And I think we've had lots of evidence, both in Parliament and elsewhere, that very little regard was given to these kinds of details. The second broad area is financial stability and sustainability. Clearly, this among some of the SOCs is a tough proposition, but it is one that is occupying the new boards where they are already in place quite extensively, but it will also mean that from a departmental point of view, we need to engage both within ourselves as a department and government, with the SOCs themselves and lenders, so that we can give them the confidence that these institutions are, from this point onwards, going to be well managed. They're going to be run as effective entities to companies where that is actually required, and that our short-term, if not medium-term aim is to, in fact, ensure that we get them out of the financial difficulties that they might have, and that sustainability also will have a positive impact on the fiscus. So the word bailout starts disappearing from the South African vocabulary, so to speak. And that will then ease the burden on the sovereign fiscus and improve the prospects of better credit ratings for the country as a whole, which again will lend itself to a positive and virtuous cycle as far as the rest of the country is concerned. The third broad area is operational efficiency. In many instances, and I'm sure some of you might raise this question, there's a shortage of coal in one place, or planes don't leave on time in another place, or whatever the case might be. And operational efficiency is critical to keep your customers, to provide the public goods and services that you are supposed to provide, but importantly, to run the business in the most efficient kind of way so that it's cost effective at the end of the day as well, and you're not wasting money. But those are the issues of today. I think these entities also need to prepare themselves for the issues of tomorrow. Because if you take the energy environment, it is a very fast-changing environment, and one which will demand a high level of agility and flexibility from some of the businesses that are involved in the energy area. Similarly, on the logistics side as well. Once cargo transfers change from one mode to another mode, again, the business has to exercise flexibility in terms of the way we actually go. So we've got to tackle both the issues of the present business models and the future business models in that sense as well. So I've covered what our aim is. So in respect of each of the entities, or some of the entities that actually report to us, let me take you through some of the progress that has been made to date. And I'm glad to see colleagues here from some of them so they can help me answer questions later. So as you know, in late January, government changed the Eskom board, and Mr. Mabuza and his colleagues were appointed to the board. At the same time, it appointed an acting CEO. Mr. Phakamani Hadebe is here. He's the acting CEO of Eskom. And in the last, they've had a bit more time than I have had. So the last, 80-odd days, working days. They've made formidable progress in stabilizing governance, in dealing with some of the key officials who were well known to be part of the capture process, and either putting them through disciplinary processes, or they've chosen to resign in order to avoid the disciplinary processes. More recently, they've been engaged with ensuring that coal supply is adequate at each of the power stations. And together with Mr. Mabuza and Mr. Hadebe, last week we visited the Hendrina power station. It was nice to be on the ground to see how a power station actually works. And this is a power station that is over 40 years old. But it was also nice to peep across the fence, so to speak, at the Optimum coal mine and see how the two conveyor belts that were supposed to be conveying coal from that mine, which was a cost-plus mine at one stage. In other words, Eskom invested in that mine. And those conveyor belts were supposed to bring coal into the power station. And those conveyor belts weren't doing that at this point in time. So it's fascinating that after the parliamentary inquiry that we had into Eskom, including the Tegeta/Optimum saga, and where 1.6 billion rands was given in guarantees, prepayments were made to this particular entity. It falls into business rescue and disrepair. It's now in the process of rescue, but now, notwithstanding the kind of investment that the public purse has made into this mine, most of it legitimately and some of it illegitimately, it's far more important for them to export coal and earn more money through exports than to keep their commitments to the Hendrina mine. So now you see endless trails of trucks coming in from the adjoining areas and bringing coal to the mine, to the power station, to keep the power station going. But if you need any update on that, I'm sure my colleagues from Eskom would be doing that. I will be able to give you that. They've also looked at their balance sheet issues. They've done a roadshow recently internationally, led by Mr. Hadebe as well. And they have some creative planning that they've done in order to keep the entity going. In the next short while, we should be able to announce a permanent CEO for the entity, and the process of appointing a CFO is also well on its way. And then more recently, they've also advertised for a COO in the business as well. Denel, you heard the announcement that we made on the 9th of April of an interim board. Subsequent to that, in the last few days, the chief executive has decided to resign and is on his way out. We've chosen Mr. Mike Kobe, who's currently the head of Denel Aviation, as the acting CEO of Denel. So you actually have a new acting CEO in place, and there's no vacuum left in that particular regard. But that board has to be complemented as well in terms of the speed and agility with which they've moved to try to stabilize the situation in Denel itself. And they've been asked to review all of the forensic reports, look into all of the information about Denel Asia and other gymnastics that have been going on in this particular entity for the benefit of people that you know better than I do. And I'm confident that the new board will actually play a major role in stabilizing Denel and meeting the kind of requirements that I set out earlier on. As far as Transnet is concerned, we were particularly concerned after several members of the board had resigned earlier on. In terms of the Companies Act, I met them about 3 weeks ago and asked them to give me reasons as to why they should not be, the technical language is rotated, and met them again last week to hear their representations, and said that we will give careful consideration to them. And yesterday decided, after appropriate consultations, that the time had come to intervene in this environment and appoint an interim board headed by Mr. Popo Molefe as chairperson of the interim board, in order that we can give far greater certainty to this particular environment. I have some statements directly from Worksmans the firm of attorneys who led the investigations into the so-called 1064 matter, that is the locomotives, where I'm sure all of you would have liked to have got involved. For every 50 million rand spent on a locomotive, you could have walked away with a 10 million rand commission, and multiply that by 100 or more times, and you would be handsomely off as far as that is concerned. But we'll come back to that if you're interested a little later. The South African Express is clearly an organization that is in great difficulty. It had an incident last week, Friday, in East London, and then yesterday there was another minor incident, I think, on a plane departing from Walfish Bay. So we met into the night last night, and 2 people have been nominated to actually this morning go to SA Express premises, talk to the technical people, get an understanding of what the situation is, and in the next 24 or more hours, or hopefully less, we'll take a final decision on how and what steps we need to take to ensure that SA Express becomes a stable entity. You'll be aware that SA Express and SAA and Mango are all state-owned airlines, and the government's aim ultimately is to ensure that they go through a merger process so that there's economies of scale on the one hand, and planes of appropriate gauge are used for appropriate routes, and we don't have the kind of duplication that we have at the moment in many instances. SAFCOL and Alexco will be coming under our eye in the next week or so. There are issues there as well, particularly on the Alexco side, in terms of the diamonds that are mined and what quantities are mined. And in fact, we've actually initiated a forensic investigation into that to understand what actually leaves that place where mining takes place, either on the shores, or that's so-called alluvial diamonds, or on land, and what gets transmitted or to the so-called marketing agency, what finds itself out of this country, what stays in this country. So those are some issues that concern us at the moment, and this investigation will give us a better idea. But there seems to be a shall we put it politely, a complex set of factors at work in this particular environment. The department and ministry were obviously, as you saw during the Eskom inquiry in Parliament, very much at the center of the state capture inquiry in Parliament, and will be at the center of the attention, or amongst the places that the Zondo Commission, headed by Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, will begin to look to find out what happened in this phenomenon and which entities were actually implicated. And we will be and are beginning to prepare for representations to the Commission itself, so that in an orderly way we can arrange all the documents that are available and make them available to the Commission, so that we can be of assistance, and the Commission itself, with that assistance, is able to expedite its deliberations on this particular matter. The DG, as you know, of the Department of Public Enterprises, Mr. Seleke, he and I have been chatting over the last while and co-determining where his talents are best utilized, and we hope that by the end of this week we'll conclude those discussions and understand where we go. So I'm particularly grateful to the acting DG for the kind of role and stability that she's actually given the department at this time of transition. In relation to the 1064 matter, Let me just put these few paragraphs from Worksman's on the table for you. I asked them whether I could quote them. They said yes. And there might be issues that arise in terms of why we had to change the Transnet board in the way we did. But what Worksman says in these few paragraphs is quite interesting. And it hasn't had much public expression and exposure, except for this past weekend. So in one paragraph they say the transaction agreements which were entered into on or about 17th of March 2014 may constitute wasteful expenditure. This is billions of rands of wasteful expenditure, potentially. The facts revealed by this investigation raise concerns as to the conduct of the erstwhile and current executives and other officials of Transnet. This conduct requires further investigation by a judicial inquiry with prosecutorial and inquisitorial powers, including the authority and jurisdiction to compel witnesses to provide relevant documentation and oral evidence. In another, they say the nature and extent of the allegations of malfeasance at Transnet, based on the findings set out in the reports, notwithstanding the limitations imposed, warrant, in quotation marks, a deep dive by the shareholder minister to identify those responsible for the conduct particularized therein. It was recommended that consideration be given to suspending all or certain of the transaction agreements, to review and possibly set aside said agreements under the principle of legality, in particular in relation to China North Rail and what's BT. There's some reference to BT. Further, that the shareholder minister establish an inquiry into the affairs of Transnet in relation to the transaction in accordance with applicable legislation. The last one I will quote to you is that in accordance with Transnet's employment and labor policies, it was further recommended that the immediate suspension of employment of those persons who are still in the employ of Transnet ought to be considered. Such suspension would ensure that there is no undue interference and or influence of any investigations to be undertaken with the investigation and or further interrogation recommended in the reports. So there's been some noise in the public domain about some of these issues, so I thought getting it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, might be very useful in terms of what their findings were. So finally, this stage of recapturing is not where we want the SOEs to preoccupy themselves. As I said at the beginning, these are powerful institutions in our economy and powerful assets of South Africa Incorporated. Secondly, that they were captured and therefore, in a sense, sabotaged from actually accomplishing what their objectives would have been and as they have been mandated to perform. Thirdly, that our aim through the various initiatives we have taken and will take in the short term is to ensure that we bring these institutions through a recapture process under good governance, sound financial management, efficient operations, and begin to prepare them not only for the present but for the future as well. And finally, to reposition them after due consideration by government so that not only can they operate effectively now, but they lay the basis for South Africa Inc. to be able to compete in tomorrow's world, 10, 15 years from now. And so they need to be sites of innovation and creativity in as much as they need to carry on with their normal business as usual as well. So that's the broader picture, ladies and gentlemen, if you like. And that will help, I hope, to give you some context to what we are trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. You've clarified all issues that I think this is the first briefing where there will not be questions. Okay, I'll take a round of 4 questions. Joseph, you, Trey, yeah, the last one, Linda. Joseph?
Thank you, Richard. Minister...
Please announce yourselves properly, in case I must call you professor or doctor or something.
No, I'm Joseph Busse from SABC Radio. Minister, on the issue of state capture, you yourself, you were very involved in the committee investigation. Now that you're on the other side, you have access to some of the information that is crucial to the work of the committee and generally the issue of state capture. And I mean, you are now. Are you able to say what the actual extent from reviewing some of the activities of the department and ministry, what the actual damage has been of the phenomenon of state capture, as you put it?
Just provide your name and the media where you come from, please. Thanks.
In the budget, in the expenditure, the estimates of expenditure at the back, I don't know if you're aware of this, but under public enterprises it discusses ESCOM's position, and it predicts that ESCOM will suffer a loss of 8 billion in the 2017-18 financial year and 15 billion in the 2018-2019 financial year. And another loss, a smaller one, in the year after I come. Can you tell us whether we will need a bailout for ESCOM in the next 2 or 3 years? And secondly, I have a copy of a report by the World Bank Commission about the state of electricity utilities, energy utilities in Africa. The report states that ESCOM is overstaffed by about 100%. It should have about 22,000 employees. Now, in the market, I mean, amongst the unions, there are serious rumors going around that ESCOM is about to embark on a dramatic staff reduction. Can you explain something?
Good afternoon. Marianne Burton, Daily Maverick. Just a couple of questions. The 1064 project, what exactly would your instructions be in order to get to the bottom of that? And for example, would that also include claiming or trying to get the money back in terms of the kickbacks? With regards to SAX, is there at this stage any considerations to unlock SAA from Treasury, where it was put in 2014, and to actually bring it back to public enterprises? Or is that a question that is perhaps too early? And with regards to Alex Cole, could you perhaps go into a little bit more details with regards? Is the issue diamonds disappearing when they should be brought? Because I mean, Alex Cole is the state miner, so to speak. Is the issue around Alex Cole not fulfilling its responsibilities to the Richtersveld community, or is it a mixture of that? Thank you.
Linda, the last one.
Yes, Minister, Mr. Seleki was...
So coming back to the SABC, what's the actual damage? I think the damage is quite significant. One, in terms of destroying governance, disrupting management teams that were effective and bringing in people who might not be as effective. Thirdly, creating a culture which says that if the top can steal, I can steal too. And this axiom that you've all heard, the fish rots from the head, and that then begins to instill a culture lower down. And that is, in the one or two instances that we have looked at more carefully, exemplified, for example, in a situation where, particularly at a managerial level, not necessarily top management, but perhaps lower down as well, staff of a particular entity create businesses, either disguised or not so disguised, and actually do business with the entity itself. And in one case, somebody described this phenomenon as bad as 8 out of 10, where 10 is a disaster. Now, if that's the case, then we have quite an endemic culture that we've got to give a lot of attention to, both as government but as the South African public as well. And if I link that to the other question around recovering money, that's the one thing that we should have mentioned, that as part of the recapture process, recovering money is a critical part. It might not happen immediately, but there's some work going on to, and we must thank investigative journalists and others who've been doing very good work in this regard, to actually track the money. And we all know, and we'll talk about this in the speech, that we've had audit firms playing a particular role, financial institutions playing another role, other types of professional institutions or private sector bodies playing yet other roles, bribes being paid in order that IT systems could be sold in one way or another, or consulting work sold for one or other purpose. And all of this actually has created quite a toxic environment, not just inside these entities, but I think in South African business as a whole. So you find KPMG in trouble today. The audit profession doesn't know whether it's coming or going, and whether the 3,000 people that are working in that institution are going to survive or not. And poor, there's no leadership, at least at a moral level, which says what is right and what is wrong in some of these instances. But they are also very, I think, serious lessons for us that the supporting professional groups that give support both to the private sector and public sector have had some real bad apples amongst them. And there's a lot of work to do to clean up in that particular regard as well. I mean, if you just take the 1064 instance, that's 5 billion rands in commission gone, so to speak. It would appear. But if you look at the pricing, that's another set of issues that some have begun to raise. How did something inflate from 30 to 50 billion overnight? And what magic calculator was at work in order to give us that kind of effect? So I think we owe the South African public a lot of answers in that particular regard. So the instruction, Marianne, to the board will be clearly understand the level of the damage, understand which contracts, as Worksman says, can in fact be reviewed or not reviewed, and get proper legal advice on that. Because if a rotten deal has been made, why must you continue to stick with it if there are other options that we actually have? And thirdly, get the money back if we can. But far more importantly, we also want to send a message in the bigger institutions to the majority honest people that work in that environment. Not everybody is rotten. You mustn't make that mistake. There are good, honest citizens that are there. What we want from them is to start blowing the whistle loud and clear as to what kind of malfeasance is actually going on in these institutions that we don't know about yet. And that would help us to work as a community of concerned people in government, in the institutions, and in society to take further this battle against corruption and corrupt individuals and hold them to account in some way. So I must compliment those honest people who've been whistleblowers, who've been passing on information, who've been assisting in one form or another and advising outsiders, so to speak, about what's really going on in the depths of the institution itself. And we need more of that. SAA, coming back to DPE, that's something that we'll have to consider as we look at the merger of the airlines. And I'm sure that in government we will look into that matter further. On Alex Gore, I don't want to say too much at this stage. Let's just leave it at what I've said. Let the forensic investigation take place. Let's continue with our review of the governance processes in Alex Gore. And as soon as we're ready, we'll get back to the public and say, like we're saying in other instances, where we intend to go. Linda, your point about Seleke and kid gloves, I don't remember putting on gloves to fight anybody, actually, firstly. Secondly, I don't appoint Seleke. Seleke is appointed, as you remember, DGs are appointed at a presidential level. And that doesn't mean I'm blaming the president either. I think everybody who's involved, or allegedly involved, in one or other form of malfeasance will have their day before the Zondo Commission. They will have their day. And if you recall, Linda, you sat through some of the late night sessions of the Parliamentary Committee's inquiry. And what answers did we get from across the table? I don't know. I wasn't part of it. I can't remember. And then you would have a lawyer sitting next to the person concerned saying, well done. Right? You gave the answer exactly as we prepared you. But that didn't fool the South African public. Those who were watching knew exactly what was going on. So you can only fool the South African public so far. After that, people can see through corrupt individuals and individuals that are not acting in their interests. So let's see where this process goes. In DPE, like I said, there are some excellent people that are there to work with, and so that's the first positive thing. Secondly, there are people who want to re-establish the good name of the department and use their skills. Like my colleague next to me, who's an engineer, who spent 4 years at Hendrina Power Station. So she was so glad we took her back there last week, so that she could go back to her old hunting ground. And it's that skill that we want to build on and ensure that we reinforce the good people in the department in the right kind of way. There are others who've jumped ship, just as we got appointed as well, and find themselves in strange places, but that will be sorted out in time as well. Can I pass on to my distinguished hat bearer and his colleague?
Mr. Mabus, kindly use the mic here. Thanks.
Yeah, Minister, thank you very much. Paramani will deal with the details of these various projected losses to the extent they are there. I will deal with the details. But just from a board and a principal standpoint, by and large, our numbers are driven by a lot that has gone into this MYPD. And in the most cases, that formula should be looking at both our costs and our revenue and our efficiency and prudence thereof. So once you depart from the point of this is the increase that you've been given, and the reality of what your costs are in the under recovery of the revenue, you end up in the situation that we are. So it is against this background that we are engaging with NESA. They have the mandate to do what they do. We have a duty to come and try and explain that our cost structure is what it is, the revenues that we're supposed to be getting we're not getting, and indeed that is why we're in the space that we have in this debate about the revenue clearing accounts. So the details Paramani will speak to. We cannot continue to say this is the percentage we should be getting on the basis of that this is the focus. We have to come back and say, whilst we're disputing whether we should or should not have been given those increases, we should be saying these are the increases that we have. If these are the increases that we have, these are the kind of revenue we will generate. Given the cost that we have, these are the gaps we're going to end up with. So Paramani will speak to them. On the second point, on the World Bank, I think I don't have the slides here with me. Paraman will give you the details on that too. But fundamentally, what the World Bank has used as a utility is really something that is far different from what ESCOM is. The utilities they were using as a model against which they were benchmarking ESCOM are the utilities that don't have the type of services and the stuff that ESCOM does. The number of customers per utility in their model is a very different one. They don't have in their utilities, for instance, sales. They don't have in their utilities services, technical. They have a utility that bulk supplies to one person, who then onward sells. So once we have tried to harmonize, taking on a like for like what they are doing as a benchmark and what we currently are doing, the numbers, Minister, looks like ESCOM should be at least 30% less, not from 50,000 in round numbers to 25,000. The number is closer to 35,000. So we are a third a bit out of kilt. But it takes us back to the point you covered earlier, Minister, about the dual mandate. Some of the utilities we are our comparators in this regard don't have a developmental mandate. We do have a commercial mandate where we have to be efficient, and we are trying to take the organization there. But we also have a developmental mandate. We have not stated that we're going to be retrenching people. We have said we need to revisit our entire structure, not only our balance sheet, but our operating structure. We need to revisit the capabilities you've spoken about, Minister, to be sure that we've got the right people at the right places doing the right things. We have also acknowledged that part of our problems, and I'm not saying overstaffing is not one of them, part of our problems, we are a bit too top heavy with, when you look at our pay scales over time, our conditions of service, there are a lot of things we need to look at. But it's also not right to say the lower ranks must pay the price by losing their jobs, whilst Megawatt Park, who have been, in the majority of cases, been more responsible for the problem. Head office has been the main cause of the most problems, whether by employing too many people, or by employing wrong people, or by allowing the malfeasance and not running an efficient organization. So what the board has approved, which Pagamani announced last week, was for a start, we will freeze no more new appointments. We will have no increases, salary increases. There will be no bonuses. They will be whether long or short term. We are governed by certain bargaining rules in our industrial relations with our employees. We are in that process now, Minister, we're having these negotiations. But from the point of view of, we will have to come back, and I'm sure our employees understand that the organization is in a difficult spot. But we do not have a dartboard that we keep on throwing darts of people that we need to take out of the organization. We'll have to resize the organization and cut our dress according to the cloth we've got.
Thanks, Chair. And just to add on this, the colleague from the report is right on these numbers that he has quoted, but these numbers are informed by the previous corporate plan. that corporate plan assumed that debt would increase to about 600 billion in 4 years' time. When the new board came into ASCOM, they took the decision that ASCOM cannot be run in the usual way how it's been run. That there needs to be severe decisions that have to be taken. Then the board decided that they needed to review the whole corporate plan because they felt that some of the suggestions or the underlinings, for example, increasing borrowing to 600 billion will border on trading recklessly. So we have worked on the financial viability of ASCOM. I think the minister touched on that. And we are hoping that in July, when we announced the financials for this year, we'll give the market and South Africans an indication as to what should be done, as the chair has already alluded to this. I just want to highlight that the truth of the matter is that we have to look at the business, not just on the tariff side. We have to look at the revenue stream, we have to look at the cost side. The cost side includes both CapEx and OpEx, and we think we have a solution. Is government going to bail out ASCOM? In the short to medium term, we have had a number of discussions with the National Treasury. We feel that we have a plan and a strategy that could deal with this issue. And in fact, even if government was to assist us, recapitalize ASCOM, under current circumstances, it will not sustain the business.
Take two questions.
That is one. With regard, again, the chair has already spoken about the World Bank paper that is quoted. There were a number of assumptions that were made by the World Bank that we have questioned. In fact, we have had direct engagement with them. For example, when they're talking generations, they only talked about maintenance. The generation in ASCOM is a big entity, the chair has indicated. It includes not just maintenance and primary. It's got technology, primary energy, group capital. On distribution, again, they only look at the distribution, not on customer services. You go through all these levels and you pick up that there are a large chunk of business that has not been included. The support business structures, such as HR, finance, legal, have not been included. And the benchmark is primarily on the hydro, and we are not hydro. We can go further and further, but as the chair has already indicated, we went through each page and all the assumptions. We used their same ratios. We then went back to them and said, this is our story. We think we are wrong in this area. And they have accepted some of those shortcomings. So we haven't just ignored the recommendations, but we have looked at it and we aligned to our own environment. And by the way, ASCOM has the longest distribution, for example, in the world. And some of the benchmarks they have are for regional utilities that go up until 5,000 or so. We're bigger than that. So those are things that we have to consider to come to a number. The analysts have used it as a conclusion, of course, but true. But we are, when we go forward, highlight how this affects our own operation, as the chair already indicated.
Okay.
Thanks, Pagamani, acting CEO. Let's go. I'm going to allow two last questions because we are pressed now for time. We must now vacate so that you also guys can have a breath. Yes, Miriam?
It really is a quick, sharp follow-up from that. I thought the question was whether the shortfall is 8 billion rand that Eskom is falling. I've not heard any of that in the response. If it's not 8 billion rand, what is the figure that you're currently working on? Thank you.
Ishmael, in Pretoria, you said you've got a question.
Thanks, Chairperson. Thanks, Chair. We do have a question from Pretoria.
You.
Things come through.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Second Jobin from Business Report. Minister, the Workmen's report, one of the board members has publicly said that the report was inconclusive in respect of key elements of the terms of reference. Was the handling of the report a factor in your decision to rotate the board members? Thank you. Back to you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Ishmael. I'm going to take one last question.
Anika?
Hi, my name is Gulelani from SABC. Just two quick questions, Minister. Mr. Nsepe, has he given you any reasons why he sought to resign from Denel? And the second question linked to that, you've said that as a department you are busy compiling files that may assist the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. Now, in that context, are you confident that perhaps maybe some of the people who are alleged to have been involved in state capture don't simply disappear with potential evidence that could be used? Thanks.
Let me squeeze in again.
Thank you very much. My name is Annika Larson. I'm a reporter at ENCA. Minister, a quick follow-up from one of my colleagues' questions. Now that you are in the ruins of the buildings of state capture, are you able to quantify the loss to the economy in terms of an actual, a roundabout amount? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we speculated during the committee investigations that it could be 100 billion or more, but I think we need to get a bit more precision on that. So I don't want to give you a number that might be misleading. Siseko, your point about the Worksman's report, I just read quotations from Worksman's themselves, which is very clear about what the board could have done and should have done, as far as I'm concerned. And that is one amongst many considerations that were taken into account after hearing the presentations made essentially by 3 of the board members from Transnet, which has a total of 14 board members, just for your information. Mr. Nsepe's resignation, that was handled by the board, so I don't know the details. And then the disappearance of documents, it's a good question that you raise, because I'm sure that's becoming a bit of an industry, because those who are implicated would not be too hesitant about destroying evidence that might show their hand at some stage. I haven't picked up anything yet within the department, but I don't think this affects just this department. It affects many entities across the board, and that's why I mentioned earlier on, and I repeat, that the good people in every one of these institutions need to be vigilant. They need to help Deputy Chief Justice Zondo do his work properly, and they need to help us as South Africa to ensure that we understand the nature of state capture and go beyond it, so that we can accomplish the vision that all of us have in the National Development Plan, for instance, for this country, and put a stop to those who want to conduct acts of sabotage, which is what destroying or stealing documents would actually amount to. So hopefully we'll get to that, but I'm sure some of that is happening. And once you find out, let me know. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Minister, just one point. We are analyzing the financials. It won't be 8 billion. And we're hoping that by July or so we'll make an announcement.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes our media briefing.
I'm all right. How are you? Good to see you.
Can you sleep at all? By the sounds of it, yeah.
Victor.